Hello, my name is Greg Vargas, Diligent's Vice President of Talent and Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Intersectionality. On behalf of Diligent and Spencer Stuart, we are delighted to bring you today's program, From Good Intentions to Action, Strategies to Become a More Diverse and Inclusive Board. Embracing all facets of board diversity and reaping its associated benefits has been a much discussed topic in recent years. Yet progress in diversifying boards in a meaningful way has been slow. Even with regulatory changes on the horizon and investor scrutiny at an all-time high, we've heard from our customers that driving change is still a challenge. We hope that during this session, we'll be able to equip you with actionable best practices and have a fantastic set of speakers for you to learn from. Kalen Holmes, who serves on the boards of One Medical Group, Red Robin Gourmet Burgers, and Zumiez, where she is Nom/Gov Chair. Kate Tamayo, Consultant and Director of Operations and Development for the North American Board Practice at Spencer Stuart, and her colleague, Claudia Pici Morris, also a consultant for the North American Board Practice at Spencer Stuart. Before we dive in, a couple of housekeeping notes. Please submit any questions you have via the chat box. If you don't get to your question during the session, we'll be sure to follow up with you directly following today's program. Additionally, this program is being recorded and a replay will be made available to all registrants via a follow-up mail that will be sent later today. With that, I'd like to hand things over to Kate.
Thank you, Greg, and I'm delighted to spend time with all of you to discuss what we're seeing in the boardroom and to hear the perspectives of Kalen Holmes, who, as Greg just mentioned, is the Nom/Gov Chair at Zumiez and also Director at One Medical Group in Red Robin. As many of you know, Spencer Stuart has been tracking changes in the boardroom for decades and will soon release the Board Index report. I'd love to spend some time now sharing our findings on board composition, and later we'll discuss some of the issues Nom/Gov chairs have told us will matter most to them and to their boards over the next 3 years. Then my colleague Claudia Pici Morris will moderate the chat with Kalen and bring some of these important topics to life. For the past 35 years, Spencer Stuart has published the Spencer Stuart Board Index, analyzing corporate governance practices of S&P 500 companies, generally the largest companies in the public markets. The first big takeaway I'd like to share is that the S&P 500 boards added 456 new independent directors for the 2021 proxy season. That's the most since the 2004 proxy season. It's worth highlighting that our data in this report is inherently backward-looking. So when I mention the 2021 Spencer Stuart Board Index, I'm referring to data found in proxies filed over the year ending May 13, 2021. In exciting news, the incoming class of directors is the most diverse we have seen. 60% of boards disclose their racial and ethnic composition, with 28% of those boards identifying directors from historically underrepresented groups by name. Nearly half, or 47%, of new directors identify as Black, African American, Asian, Hispanic, Latino, Latina, American Indian, Alaska Native, or multiracial. 43% are women. Together, directors from these historically underrepresented groups accounted for 72% of all new directors. This is up from 59% last year and 31% from 10 years ago. Nearly all of the gains in the diversity of the new class of directors are due to the increase in Black African American directors. 1/3 of the new independent directors are Black and African American, which is 3 times more than last year and the most since we began tracking this data in 2008. The representation of Asian directors among new directors fell slightly to 7% from 8% last year. Hispanic, Latino, Latina directors made up 7% of the new director class, an increase from 3% last year. The representation of the Hispanic, Latino, Latina directors among new directors has vacillated between 3 and 5% since we began collecting this data in 2008, and it's not reached above 6% until this year. However, due to the persistent issue of low boardroom turnover, the addition of new directors from underrepresented groups has had little impact on the overall diversity of the S&P 500 boards. Just 21% of S&P 500 directors in 2021 are Black, African American, Hispanic, Latino, Latina, Asian, American Indian, Native Alaskan, or multiracial. And I'd like to add that this is the first time Spencer Stuart has been able to track the racial and ethnic diversity of the full set of S&P 500 boards. While the representation of some demographic groups on the S&P 500 boards more closely reflects the US population, there is a significant disparity in representation for others. According to the US Census Bureau, 42% of the US population is in the underrepresented groups I've just named, which is double the represented groups in the S&P 500 directors, or 21%. The largest disparity is between the Latino, Latina, Hispanic group, which is only 5% of S&P 500 board directors, and the representation in the US population is 18.5%. Women now represent 30% of all S&P 500 directors. This is the most ever, and an increase from 28% last year and 16% a decade ago. But last year we saw a decrease in female representation among new directors. And our survey of nominating governance committee chairs, which we'll go over in more depth in a moment, suggests that fewer women may be recruited on boards in the next several years. Among boards' recruiting priorities, the recruitment of women fell from 3rd place last year to 10th this year. At the time of our data analysis cutoff, which again was May 13th, 2021, all but one board had at least one female director. Boards have been increasing the number of women directors over the last several years. So now 96% of boards include 2 or more women directors, compared to 58% a decade ago. Boards have focused on increasing gender diversity over the last several years, and in many cases have increased the size of their board to do so. In the 2021 proxy year, for example, 78 boards expanded in size to add 1 or more women directors. And this is on top of the 76 boards that expanded to increase gender diversity last year. The majority of newly hired younger next-gen directors are from historically underrepresented groups as well. 16% of incoming class S&P 500 directors are 50 or younger, essentially flat from the last decade. But this year, the next-gen group is significantly more diverse. 69% are from historically underrepresented groups, and this is compared to 40% last year. Although boards continue to add younger directors, the average age of S&P 500 directors remains unchanged. The average age of new independent directors is 57.5, which is actually a year older than it was 10 years ago. And the average age of all independent directors of S&P 500 companies is 63.1. This is largely unchanged, again, in the last 10 years. Independent directors range in age from 33 to 96, but most directors, about 85%, are 60 or older. While we've made some strides in bringing on new directors from underrepresented groups, diversity continues to lag in board leadership. If we look at the 2 historically underrepresented groups uniquely, just 8% of S&P 500 board chairs and 10% of lead directors are from historically underrepresented racial or ethnic groups. And similarly, only 8% of independent board chairs and 13% of lead or presiding directors are women. This year, 193 companies, or about 39% in the S&P 500, included a statement in their proxy committing to diverse slates when considering new directors. This is up from 24% last year. Some boards are adopting diversity goals, and others are including additional proxy disclosures focused on diversity. This year, 32 boards included LGBTQ+ disclosures in their proxy statements. And of these 32 boards, only 5%, only 5 named the LGBTQ directors by name. One board disclosed having a disabled or differently abled director, and 3 boards disclosed having a military veteran on their board. And I must say, if you're a NomGov committee member and your recruiting partner is not proactively showing you slates with incredible talent from underrepresented groups, you probably don't have the right partner. Boards should not have to ask their partners to show them underrepresented talent. From our annual Nominating and Governance Chair survey, recruiting directors from historically underrepresented groups is once again a top priority. And as you can see, another accelerated priority is global experience, which was not a top 5 priority 2 years ago. But conspicuous in its absence is recruiting women, as I mentioned earlier. Gender diversity, the 4th priority for NomGov committees last year, didn't rank in the top 5 this year. And in fact, in terms of recruiting profiles, it fell very far from 3rd place to 10th. So as we saw earlier, the change in board priorities is also reflected in the 2021 proxy composition trends, with the recruitment of women slowing. 43% of the new class of S&P 500 directors are women, and that's compared to 47% last year. So an interesting question for us to ask is, has this movement had its moment, or is the recruitment of women simply a given priority at this point? Looking ahead, enhancing board diversity remains a high priority, but 3 new priorities joined the top 5 list this year, including today's top priority for NomGov committee chairs, which is overseeing environmental, social, and governance initiatives, developing a board succession strategy, enhancing board effectiveness, and overseeing DE&I round out that list. Turnover during the last 5 years has been consistently low, and this year is no different. Almost 60% of S&P 500 boards appointed a new independent director in the 2021 proxy year, translating to an overall turnover of less than 1 new director per board. While the number of S&P 500 boards disclosing a mandatory retirement age for directors has declined modestly during the past 10 years, to 70% today from 73% in 2011, the retirement ages of boards with these policies continue to rise. Half, or 51% of boards with age limits, have a mandatory retirement age of 75 or older. That's compared to 20% a decade ago. 18% of boards report not having a mandatory retirement age, and 12% do not discuss mandatory retirement in their corporate governance guidelines. Few boards have established director term limits. 31 S&P 500 boards report having explicit term limits for non-executive directors, 2 more than last year. The term limits range from 10 to 20 years, with 73% of those that have them setting them at 15 years or more. To accelerate the addition of fresh perspectives in the boardroom, a popular option at the moment is to simply increase the size of the board. And that is the route many boards have taken. 88 companies have expanded the size of their board to add 1 or more directors from underrepresented ethnic and racial groups, and 78 companies have expanded the size of their board to add 1 or more women. Yet, increasing board size is not a sustainable option in our view, and in our experience, most boards consider around 10 directors to be their optimal size. So transitioning now to our next segment, we all know that a board's ability to provide appropriate oversight over strategy and risk requires the right skills, experience, and perspectives in the boardroom. It requires ensuring the strategic plan aligns with the opportunity and the company's ability to exploit that opportunity. So in our next segment, we'll hear from Kalen Holmes about best practices for ensuring different perspectives and that they're not only brought into the boardroom, but are integrated. So I'd like to now turn it over to my colleague, Claudia Pici Morris, to moderate our Q&A with Kalen.
Thank you, Kate, and very nice to have you, Kalen, in this important discussion. As we saw, one of the big issues with increasing gender and underrepresented communities in the board will require more turnover. But it's not sustainable, as Kate said, to continue to add boards. But I've seen in my own practice that when we've been asked to find particularly underrepresented communities to add more diversity to the board, they're actually adding the seat. So I'm curious, in your experience, what you've seen with your boards in terms of just ensuring that the refreshment is happening, and you're allowing that time to then ultimately bring in more diversity to the boardroom.
Well, thank you so much, Claudia. I have to say, of the three boards I sit on, I am the GovNom chair for Zumiez, and feel very fortunate to have a partner in Rick Brooks as the CEO, who is not just aligned, but truly leading this effort. And we are committed to ensuring that there is continual thoughtfulness and refreshment of the board, and that is defined first and foremost by the strategy of the company, and where that strategy is targeted in the next 5+ years, and what skills and experiences and voices we need around the board table in order to ensure that we are optimizing for that business opportunity.
Do you employ other tools? As we heard, the retirement ages continue to go up for directors to ultimately step off the board, and of course tenure limits are 15 years. So the idea of creating an artificial way of pushing refreshment is obviously not going to be the answer. So I'm curious what kind of tools you may use, or how you communicate with your boards in terms of their intentions and their willingness to actually make space for the next generation.
Absolutely. Well, and of the boards that I'm on, we do not have any retirement requirements or term limits. However, we have been very effective on all three in refreshing through attrition, some addition, but mostly through attrition. And that is a commitment from all board members. The first thing that I think is important, and this is with any discussion in regards to inclusion and equity, is starting by understanding the market opportunity that the company has. And in consumer businesses, it is relatively easy when you look at the face of your customer or consumer today and what that face might be for 5 to 10 years from now, and understanding that to deeply understand that customer and consumer, you need people that are at the very top of the organization who are aligning and setting the strategy of the company, to know that consumer intimately. And so it's just understanding that, yes, this is absolutely an obligation. It's an imperative. But first and foremost, it is an incredible competitive business opportunity. And so there's a strong desire to ensure that we are doing what we need to do to have the right voices in the room. From a tools perspective, and again, in all three companies, we have established a skills and experience matrix that's not generic. It's very nuanced to the company. It is completely filtered through the lens of the strategy of the company 5 years out. And we have certain broad requirements and broad priorities that include the diversity and equity components, as well as things like availability of meaningful time and no conflicts of interest. Those are just assumed up front. But then we go much more unique and deep in what we truly need around the table. We have definitions to those areas and a rating scale from 1 to 5, 5 representing a strong match, 1 representing a not a match. And each year our independent directors and non-independent directors rate themselves against these areas using the rating scale, and we sit down and look at it and talk about it and discuss what it means in regards to where we need to be going in the future. So yes, that's a tool annually.
Yeah, that's definitely a best practice in terms of just making sure that you're refreshing the composition of the board and how you evaluate that composition and align it towards strategy. I definitely see that as a best practice with many of my clients. Another tool that many of our clients have used, and I'm curious if you've done this on your board, is doing a very disciplined board assessment. And this is not to find problems or to particularly call individuals out, but more to, as you're kind of putting together a composition, that you're testing the relevance of the individuals and having a very frank conversation about their intentions to stay on the board and or not, and ensure that conversation about refreshment is happening. And many times there's a peer review, one-on-one feedback that's ultimately given to those directors. I'm curious if that's something that your boards have done.
Yes, with all 3 boards, we have the assessment that I mentioned earlier is a self-assessment against a set of experiences or skill areas. However, in addition to that, we have individual feedback that we provide to board members. For one of my boards, it's still a term board, so whichever set of directors, a couple of my boards, whichever set of directors are up for re-election in that term, we provide individual feedback. My other board is annual renewal, and so we provide feedback annually. And there is a conversation with the chair and the chair or lead independent director of the board and the NomGov chair individually to the directors to share that feedback and input and to discuss how there could be areas for perhaps more effective focus and the areas to continue to demonstrate because of the value that's being added in the room. So yes, we do those annually. And as part of that, there is then a discussion and conversation about the intent to remain on the board, whether it's for the next term or the year, and interest in committee assignments, because we're very diligent in understanding how we're staffing our committees and how we're actually building succession for the chairs of those committees.
That's definitely a wise move and something that many boards, if they're not doing today, should do as a regular practice. You mentioned earlier that you work in close partnership, particularly as a NomGov chair, with the CEO of that company, and ensuring that the tone is really set from the top for the organization. I'm curious how your board kind of covers the topic of diversity, not just in terms of the group that are on the table, but in setting culture for the company and just setting the right tone and message.
Yeah, well, and again, I think I feel somewhat honored to be part of these 3 companies. We all have opportunities, no doubt, but there is a strong commitment and has been for the focus on equity and inclusion. And it is inherent in the culture of the company. It is something that is deeply discussed from, I'd say, the ground level up in the organization from a board perspective, and this is across all 3. For the time that I've been serving on the board, we have reviewed key diversity metrics, pay equity metrics, discussed as we talk about broader succession planning beyond the senior leadership team, what the diverse slate of candidates looks like coming up into that pipeline of talent feeding the senior roles. There have been some opportunities to bring in some more intentional diversity consultants in a couple of the areas that I work with more recently. But the focus of the discussing the importance of an inclusive culture and then understanding the metrics behind what the company looks like beyond just the senior leadership team has been something that's been integrated in the board meetings, since I've been sitting on the boards.
So even in the boardroom, is diversity a regular topic of discussion? Is it something the full board covers, or is it something that's covered more in a committee discussion?
Well, I think what we've begun to do is have this broader discussion of inclusion and equity that is incorporated into the ESG initiatives. And while there might be specific committees that are assigned certain aspects of ESG to do the work, we bring those conversations, the strategy of ESG, the key components, the initiatives where we're going to be putting the focus. That is a board discussion. And it either is a board discussion once a year, or depending on just the simple cadence of the initiatives, there's an update at the right quarterly meeting to discuss that. It's an ongoing conversation. It's not just a point in time discussion.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. And I know a lot of the NomGov chairs that we talk to talk about the fact that it has become a regular board conversation. Not just because of the pressure that's coming down from all different organizations, institutional investors, all the activists around social justice and so forth, but just because it's the right thing to do, whether or not you're a consumer-oriented company or not. And that it's not just about your shareholders anymore, it's about the stakeholders, which includes your employees, the communities that you work in, and so forth. So that makes a tremendous amount of sense. If we take it back to the boardroom, when you think about the recruitments that you may have done to enhance diversity on your boards, have you done anything different in terms of how you've onboarded those directors, or how you ensure that they have the right amount of voice in the room?
The one thing that we have done in a couple of the boards is, well, for all, we've become much more thoughtful about onboarding. I'll highlight Zumiez. Again, the CEO, Rick Brooks, does a phenomenal job of taking his own personal responsibility to ensure every new board member is fully onboarded in regards to the company's culture and the brand and just the key initiatives and the leadership team. We do assign a board mentor to all new board members. And there is, NASD put together a report several years ago into best practices of onboarding that is shared and discussed. We do have checklists in regards to what we want to share with the new board members, at what point in time, so that they can understand the historical aspects that they need in order to really get a great start. But yes, we have individual board members who are assigned as mentors to the new board members throughout their first year. And we have individual conversations throughout. And it has not been, I have not experienced any issue with any new board member coming into any of the boards and having a voice that is well heard and impactful.
Yeah, and I do think it's important that the chairman also ensures engagement, regardless as to whether or not the person is the first woman on the board or the first person from an underrepresented community. But it's important to make sure that everybody feels like they have a voice, and so it's a big part of the inclusion thoughts that you think about, particularly around the table in the boardroom. Is there anything else from a onboarding perspective, or in terms of even in the dynamics in the room, that you think would be helpful for others who are, bringing on the first, Hispanic, Latino director, or someone from an underrepresented community? Is there any advice that you would give NomGov chairs as they think about that?
Well, I think I would say it broadly. That for any new board member coming onto the board, I think it is important that there is a thoughtfulness on that onboarding, that the chair, lead independent director, and non-gov chair take personal responsibility to ensure that that first year there are plenty of resources there to debrief after a board meeting, discuss any questions that one might have, giving access to the leadership team and having that individual, the new board member, able to connect personally with the leadership team. If there are particular functional areas where they can go deep, having that relationship built early on is important and critical. And just the new board member having, the time and bandwidth to be able to invest in learning. I think it's just some of the basics of what we know good onboarding to be.
And I'm sure with COVID, as you've added directors to your boards, and I know we have one in common where we added someone from an underrepresented community onto one of your boards. Is there anything different in the COVID kind of world that you would think would be important for individuals, again, regardless as to whether or not it's the first underrepresented community or just generally the first an additional diverse director? Is there anything, given COVID and the fact that people are not congregating in person, that you think is important to consider?
Yeah, well, I mean, that definitely has been an impediment for onboarding, no doubt. There have been a lot of follow-up individual conversations, some via phone and some via Zoom and, other modalities, to just create those relationships. And there has been, for all three boards, there has been a significant amount of investment from the CEOs. And, I will specifically say for Zumiez, Tom Campion, who is the executive chair and founder of Zumiez, personal commitments that they have made in making the connection to the new board members and doing all that they can to ensure that those new board members have all the materials and background that they need. But just many more touch points, intentional touch points.
Yeah, outside the boardroom. And I think that is, I'm sure, very well received because it's very hard to build relationships via video. So spending time outside the boardroom to really ensure the new directors have a personal connection, I'm sure is a best practice that non-gov chairs should consider. I'm curious if there's anything else in terms of culture of the board that you think would be important to highlight as you think about inclusiveness in the room and even how you're communicating with the broader organization.
Well, I think that, the first spot there is that there shouldn't be a unique culture in the boardroom that isn't directly aligned to the culture of the company, because so much of the recruitment process should be informed and defined first and foremost by a cultural alignment with the company's culture. So there is synergies between the culture amongst the board members and the senior leadership team and the culture that is exhibited within the company. If you're an employee of the company, I think that's critical and that's important. In addition to that, uniquely to the boardroom, and it's it's defined in different ways, but it's consistent across all three companies that I serve on. There's a culture of accountability amongst the board, that we hold ourselves accountable to the unique job that we play for this company, and the one or two key priorities that we really have as board members, and that we hold ourselves honestly accountable to those. And I do think that cultural element allows us to put our individual personas aside, so that when it does come time to acknowledge that we have significant gaps in some of our skills and experience areas, given where the strategy is moving or given where the consumer is moving, that individuals put themselves aside and allow for the right broader perspective to be in the room. And, so I think that's key. That's key.
Yeah. And speaking of accountability, there's a lot more that's falling on a non-gov chair's desk these days in terms of accountability, particularly all the reporting and disclosure requirements that are coming down the pike. You know, what advice would you give other boards for telling their story about diversity and ensuring that they are kind of not just reporting numbers for numbers' sake or just meeting the minimum baseline, but actually making this a part of the narrative?
Well, I think you start by not just making it an exercise to check the box, and you're not doing it just because you're told you now have to do it, and you don't understand the true competitive advantage of it. And I'd say start there by deeply understanding, for all of these ESG initiatives, understand which aspects of them are most critical to your business strategy and who your stakeholders are and what matters the most to those stakeholders and to the strategy of the company. And instead of taking a broad swath approach, do the work to filter which key initiatives will actually move the mark and create a competitive advantage for the company, and report through that lens and report on that. Because it is all, at the end of the day, adding to the future viability of the company and the strength of its strategy. So I just, stating it in terms of what business this business is in and what is the most relevant in this business, and therefore where are you going to put both the money, the resources, and the attention, and report through that.
And how about at the board level, the idea of disclosing their people's backgrounds, LGBTQ, as we saw in the data that Kate put out, that there's some boards that are being very specific about by naming people in the different categories. Is that something that you see your board doing, or is that something that you see that's a positive development?
Well, yeah, I definitely think that there's no reason to not be transparent. We are continuing to evolve in that regard. And there are, in areas where it's not evident, I think that we continue to find ways to work through that transparency. I wouldn't say we're all the way fully to bright across the boards that I'm on, but that's not an intent. It's not an intent to be opaque.
Right. And if you think about, just the topic of understanding diversity inclusion more intimately, do any of your boards have programs in place for the board members to get some training or some understanding of how to think about things maybe a little bit differently from a different lens?
We have not had unique board training on this. I would say we are in certain areas, the approach that the broader company is taking, we'll have discussions with the board on, but we have not yet had any specific board only focused diversity or inclusion training. It's something that is, I think part of this has been the last year and a half. It's difficult to do via Zoom or via whatever you're using, but that's not an excuse. I think it's something that is on the horizon. But again, tailored to the board, but also with continuity to what's being discussed at the broader company level and what's being experienced at the broader company level.
Excellent. Well, I'm just curious, I know as you're thinking about refreshment of your board and trying to bring more diversity around the table in one form or another, is there any advice that you'd give in terms of recruiting strategies that you've used that have been successful, or whether it's a more proactive strategy or just a more disciplined approach? We talked about the Rooney Rule, that many of the companies reported that they're using the Rooney Rule, and it's something that we do advise our clients. If you are looking for someone from an underrepresented community, then that should be the sole focus of that. The candidates that you look at, but every list that we put forward, regardless of what the ultimate desire is, should have people from underrepresented communities and women to make sure that they are have as much chance as any other to get an opportunity to serve on a board. But I'm curious what you've seen in your travels.
Yeah, well, I think we've had a combination. We've in some of the boards as you've just shared earlier with one of the boards, we've partnered with Stuart. We've partnered with other search partners. There are some in this area that are exclusively focused in a diversity type of lens. And another board, we've done it ourselves. And we've actually rolled up our sleeves and done the work ourselves for lead generation. I think the most critical, important piece is starting with understanding what specific areas you're going after, and then who within that specific target is world class, and who are the leaders within that organization that have created that to be world class, and then start activating and leading. What you don't do is sit around the table and say, I know so and so. You don't share your own personal phone directory, because you're going to miss something in that regard. So you do have to work harder. And I would say the building of the slate, if you're doing it right, by definition, it should include someone. It should include talent from either a gender or underrepresented group, because that is if you're looking for how, let's say, digital is interfacing youth consumer lives, by definition, those who are the top and the best are those who understand who those youth are going to be in the future, and they should be on the site. It shouldn't be something you have to do in addition to. It's just going to be part of the process. That's not always the case. The other thing I would say is, for every board seat, you are selecting an individual, obviously, but you're really building a team. You should be looking at the collective skills that the board members bring. And that's when you do the skills composition matrix and you see, if you put a number to it and you see on a scale of 1 to 5, where are you from a composition perspective? Who brings what uniquely? Not everyone has got to be considered, a SEC validated audit chair necessarily. There are some who come with different perspectives, and that's what brings the richness or robustness to the board. So understanding when you're hiring a new board member, how that individual plays into the current team and what they uniquely bring and what they might not need if you have plenty of it already elsewhere. And I think that just, again, further helps bring that voice into the room that's a unique voice that allows that individual to immediately start making an impact.
Well, it's interesting that you said in one of the occasions you actually did the work yourself. We actually advise many of our clients to be proactive in just getting to know the universe of talent out there, so that when the time comes, you already have a relationship with that person and can ask them to join the board. Is that something that you employed on your own?
Yeah, Claudia, I think that's such a great segue. I think one of the best practices is, and this just comes from my own background of being an HR executive. The best recruitment is always proactive when there's not a job or a need.
Right.
And so continually making this part of the board's work to understand the importance of lead generation and to engage with individuals. And what I have found, because I've had at least 30 of these conversations myself at this point, there is nobody who gets upset or put out by somebody reaching out and saying, we don't necessarily have an opportunity now, but what we are wanting to do is better understand you as an individual, your interests, and any potential fit that we might have. And if there isn't an opportunity at this moment, there's this broader kind of friends and family concept of resourcing together. There's plenty, when you're looking at specifically board seats, there's plenty of opportunity to just connect and just be a great, a great network, if nothing else. And to keep that an active conversation is something that is important. In the one area that we did recruit ourselves, we continue to recruit ourselves, we were focused on the Latinx youth, and we needed not just to have a Latinx on the board because we had to focus on the Latinx youth. We needed someone who deeply contemporarily understood the interface of digital to that Latinx youth buying habits and culture. And we as board members completely exhausted the contacts that we might know and have. And I reached out to the Latin America Corporate Director Group and talked to their executive director and spent an hour explaining what we were looking for. And we vetted, I connected with 15 to 20 people through that process that were amazing, incredible talent sitting in senior vice president and C-suite jobs throughout the United States that I still stay connected to. And it was a very rewarding process for me because I just, got to enrich my own experience by talking to so many brilliant talent. And I realize, I think it's just a reiteration of if you just, it's not acceptable anymore to say the talent's not out there. You have to try, you have to invest, you have to be committed. And it's the brilliance of bringing this talent on the board is, I can't reinforce it enough. Yeah.
Well, your board is lucky that you invest so much time. It is a very intense, time-consuming process, but definitely rewarding. And it's something that we do help boards with to provide, introductions to individuals well before the need. And it allows us to partner very closely with, with boards around what's really most important, get to really know the company. Because with these communities, I think there's a lot of concern around being a check-the-box candidate versus really being a contributor. And so the more that you can, either as a firm or as an individual, share the reason why it's so important, how strategic it is to the organization, then the higher the likelihood is that that you'll be successful in recruiting the talent that you're looking for. And so I'm sure that you've had that experience, but that's something that I think is critical as you're looking at bringing on exceptional talent. You can't just make a phone call and expect that's all that's going to happen. You have to cultivate the relationship.
And we do it across the board. While I'm chair of NomGov on this one board, all the board members and the chairman and the CEO of that board spend their dedicated time doing this. And you're right. When I speak to my colleagues and board peers that get calls, it is painfully evident when you're being called just to check the box. And people are not interested in doing that. They will not join that board if that is what they think. That no one is waiting with bated breath to fill a seat just because they check some box. That's just not going to happen. So, and there's plenty of other boards out there that are building it through the strategic lens and ensuring that every board member is around that table because they believe they can contribute something very significant and unique to the company. And that's why we all want to sit on a board. So, yeah.
Yeah. Well, I really appreciate all your time and insights that you brought to this discussion today. I don't know if you have any final thoughts that you want to share with the group.
Well, I think, one of the things, we always talk about kind of in a nutshell, what are the key things to do, right? What are the key steps? And I would say it would be first, again, understand that this is a market opportunity and do the work to understand what that market opportunity is. Be intentional and commit to the process then as a board. Take it as a true board responsibility and accountability. Do build out a skill and experience matrix that is nuanced and unique to the company's strategy and use it on an annual basis. And honestly assess as a board, the current composition of the board, identifying the gaps and the need for renewal. And then the last one, which is always the first, be accountable to the stakeholders and do the work. And make it the way the board works versus just checking the box. That would be it.
Absolutely. Well, thank you again for all your time. And just wanted to make one more suggestion that for those of you who are on this call and have an interest in serving on the board, feel free to reach out to us. We are always looking for exceptional talent. And in particular, Inspector Stuart takes the time to meet people proactively for exactly that reason. So we can build a relationship with individuals and make sure that we're partnering them with the right board opportunities. So once again, thank you so much, and look forward to speaking with you again in the future.
Thank you for asking me to participate. Thank you.